2000s were a special time in horror as we got to see some of the most iconic horror films ever made. Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, Zombieland, The Descent, Hatchet, Shaun of the Dead, 28 Days Later, 28 Weeks Later, The Devil's Rejects, Saw, Final Destination, Eight-Legged Freaks, Freddy vs. Jason. I said iconic, not good. Even if you haven't seen all of those movies, you've more than likely heard of them, and all of them seem to be well liked no matter how niche an audience they've made. Here's looking at you, Eight-Legged Freaks. Now, all of these films left a mark on the horror genre as a whole. Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, Shaun of the Dead, Zombieland, 28 Days and Weeks Later, all brought zombies to the mainstream, and thankfully people still love zombies, right? And say what you will, but films like The Descent, Hatchet, The Devil's Rejects, while nothing groundbreaking, they all did their respective genre very well, with The Descent being an excellent creature feature thriller, Hatchet and Saw both bringing new names to the slasher genre. One more well-known than the other, but nevertheless. And The Devil's Rejects was a Rob Zombie film, but nevertheless, all of these films left a huge impact on horror as a whole. Then there's Stay Alive. For those of you who don't know what this movie is, and I imagine that is most of you given that the movie made barely any money, and anyone I've ever asked about it has no idea what I'm talking about. It's actually a very clever movie. It's using an idea that surprisingly hasn't been used much in horror, or much media, to be honest. The film is about a video game where if you die playing it, then you die in real life. While not the most original idea, it's still very creative, and it's better than a killer doll movie, right? The only other thing I can think off the top of my head that has actually used something like this was in an episode of CSI where a GTA-like game was being investigated because crimes that were happening in-game were also happening in real life. But besides that, I really can't think of any other movie or TV show that's used video games like this. I'm honestly surprised this idea hasn't been used more. But real quick, let me take you back to 2006 where gaming, while more accepted than it was in the 1990s, still wasn't super mainstream, so the fact that a film like this was made then is actually pretty cool. And to be honest, given how many studios have handled horror movies that deal with mainstream technology, just like a Countdown, it's surprising that it hasn't been used more. The basic plot of the film is that there's a video game where you're on a New Orleans plantation owned by Elizabeth Bathory, and your objective is to kill zombie children, find her diary, and put her spirit to rest. If you know anything about the real Blood Countess, you'll know that there's a bit wrong with that setup, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The film stars John Foster, Samir? Sam Armstrong, Frankie Muniz, Sophia Bush, and Jimmy Simpson. How is Jimmy Simpson the most relevant out of everyone I just listed? As stated before, the film was released in 2006, so a lot of the stuff in this movie is very 2006, from the clothing, the dialogue, the music, the soundtrack, and pretty much everything about it. But despite that, the film does quite a lot well, if I'm being honest. The acting is surprisingly good, given that it's a 2000s horror movie that was made for a very small budget. None of the actors at the time, besides maybe Frankie Muniz, who was coming off of Malcolm in the Middle, none of them are really that big. I don't think Jimmy Simpson was on It's Always Sunny yet, and Sophia Bush, John Foster, they weren't big names, and to be honest, they still really aren't. But yeah, so Jimmy Simpson is giving the best performance, surprisingly. If you know anything about him, that is kind of a shock. Frankie Muniz and Sophia Bush are also just pretty good. They're very solid performances. They're nothing special, but they are good for what the movie needs. Sam Armstrong, I'll be honest, she is not doing that great, but she's passable. And then John Foster's just kind of there. He's really nothing special, if I'm being honest. But also, besides that, the film does scares and tension surprisingly well, and I can't emphasize this enough. The sound design in this movie is so good. In the movie, when the Blood Countess Elizabeth Bathory is hunting down her victims in the real world, there's a controller shaking sound effect that I cannot stress enough is actually, despite being cheesy, very haunting. For about 24 hours after watching this movie, the sound of a controller shaking, must admit, it does startle me. This movie made a controller shaking scary, and I have to commend that. Also, the spirit of Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, despite the incredibly terrible historical inaccuracies of her, which I will get into later, is utterly terrifying. Her ghost is just so menacing. Look at that face. I don't know about you, but that's all I can see when I close my eyes now. The kill scenes where Bathory is killing the victims are honestly very intense and legitimately full of tension and just very well done. As much as I love the film, and I just went on about how the sound design, the scares, and even the acting is pretty good, the film unfortunately doesn't do everything well. Like I said, John Foster is just kind of there, and his performance is pretty stiff, which wouldn't be so bad if he wasn't the main character. He's the guy we're following through this whole thing, and he's the most bland of all of them. He's giving the weakest performance. I know in my Puppet Master review I made fun of the guy who played Rick, calling him Plank because of his stiff acting, but if it means anything to that actor, if he even cares, I would honestly go back and take away that nickname and give it to John Foster in this. And as I said earlier, when you're playing the video game, you're on a plantation in New Orleans hunting down the spirit of Elizabeth Bathory. However, if you know anything about her true story, you would know how terribly inaccurate that is. So yeah, the spirit of Elizabeth Bathory is the antagonist of the film and in the video game Stay Alive. You must explore her plantation and find her diary and put her soul to rest. That's just a simplified version of the film. But the thing is, Elizabeth Bathory never stepped foot in the United States and was alive in the 15 to 1600s. And also, the film takes place in New Orleans, founded in 1718, 104 years after she died. And the film is heavily implying that she lived in the 17 and 1800s and was possibly a slave owner. That's only hinted at, it's never confirmed. But no, that's not who she was. She wasn't much better than that, but Elizabeth Bathory was a countess in Hungary who was reported to have tortured and killed hundreds of young girls and supposedly bathed in their blood. Now, that part actually was kept in the film of her killing young women and bathing in their blood because she thought it would keep her young. However, in real life, she was tried, convicted, and then sealed into her castle for 4 years before she would die. In the film, she was killed in a similar way, but her body was put into a mausoleum on the plantation. Historical inaccuracies are something that don't usually bother me, if I'm being honest. You know, I'm watching Texas Chainsaw Massacre and it's inspired by true events, but that specific killings never actually really happened. I don't really care. But when it comes to using a real life like Elizabeth Bathory, I feel like that's a more sensitive subject and should have been handled a lot better. However, while yes, it does bother me, it doesn't bother me enough to ruin a film. It's not Bohemian Rhapsody. If you know, you know, I'm not getting into it. But yeah, this film, despite the historical inaccuracies, it's not something that ruins the film for me. It's something that I'm able to overlook, but the fact they changed so much brings into the question, why didn't they just create a new character inspired by Bathory? That way the film could have possibly created a new iconic horror villain, just like how Saw gave us Jigsaw. They could have created someone new without having to mess with the real life person. Like I said, it doesn't ruin the film for me, but depending on how you feel about historical inaccuracies in films, that will possibly affect your enjoyment of this one. So, I know I just kind of went on a bit of a rant there, but something else that doesn't quite work for me in this film is the finale is kind of underwhelming. The build-up, however, is very well done, as John Foster tries to put the spirit of Bathory to rest. He fails to do so, and then just lights her body on fire, and then the mausoleum burns down. Then the movie just kind of ends. Granted, it does end with it being revealed that the video game does get widely released and her spirit will forever live on in PlayStation 2s. But the overall fight at the end with Bathory's spirit, it's honestly kind of funny. Like, her spirit on fire, just running around the room, is unintentionally hilarious. It's definitely not the worst horror finale you'll ever see. Okay, so yeah, I just went on a rant about the historical inaccuracies, and I also mentioned how I don't care for the entire finale. But I still love this movie. The acting is cheesy enough that it's good, even with the performance of the main character, and while the writing leaves a lot to be desired sometimes, I think the killer video game idea works well enough that it overcomes a lot of the issues that the script has. It's creative, very unique. The fact there haven't been more mainstream movies about this concept is insane to me. In fact, I can't think of another movie that uses a video game like this. Yes, there are movies built around video games like The Wizard and Pixels, but not only are those terrible, they're also not horror. And then when it does come to horror movies and technology, what do you have? Countdown? Hashtag horror? Unfriended? Cell? Yeah, this film is surprisingly in a league of its own. It's kind of crazy to think about. Plus, as I said before, the horror aspects of this film are very strong. The atmosphere, the production design, the sets, the wardrobe is surprisingly pretty good. Except for Frankie Muniz' hat, there's no excuse for that. But it all works so well. The atmosphere the film is able to create, especially in the final act, despite the hilariousness of Bathory's spirit running around on fire, is so good that the buildup overshadows it. Plus, the kills are also very effective. The kills in the movie are just gory enough that, if you like gore, they satisfy that, but they're not gory to the point where if you hate gore, you're gonna hate it and not be able to watch it. The film is incredibly stupid at points, but it's a film that I can watch pretty much any time. It's just a fun movie that you can watch with your friends and have fun with. You don't need to take it seriously. It's just a film that you can put on with some friends, have some drinks, and just laugh and have a good time with, but it's also scary enough that it'll interrupt the laughter, because while there's some parts that are funny, it's also still pretty scary at points. But yeah, I love this movie, flaws and all. It's just a fun movie, and I will give it a very respectable 6 out of 10. So I said this is a fun movie to watch with friends, and I've actually forced several of my friends to watch it. So I thought I would send them a text and ask for their opinions. So here's what they sent me. So the first friend said, "Stay Alive, the movie that comes from human consumption and disturbance that will give you nightmares for days." Another friend said, "It was an interesting story with meh graphics, I'd give it a 3 out of 5. You know what? That's fair. And my other friend just simply said, "I loved it." Hey everyone, I know this video is a tad different from the Puppet Master videos, but I hope you still enjoyed it and stick around for more videos in the future. I'm going to try to put out videos about once a week. I can't guarantee anything, but that's what I'm going to try to do. Anyway, take care of yourself, stay hydrated, and I'll see you next time.